Hey everybody, I'm here with Joe DiNitto and Jim Massett, and they've agreed to answer a couple questions to me, with me. Tracks with a large stagger in width between them can indicate wide-chested buck. A long stride length can indicate a long old buck. Toe drag marks between each track can indicate a heavy-bodied deer. All of these are decent indicators of mature bucks. Even bucks that are not mature, though, can express track characteristics that suggest their tracks belong to a bigger, older deer. Likewise, mature deer can express track characteristics that suggest their tracks belong to smaller, younger deer. With that in mind, what are some of the more minute details you look for while observing tracks that indicate a mature deer? Do the tracks need to meet certain preconceived criteria in order for you to follow them?
Well, if I can, Jim.
Sure, Joe.
When you had mentioned about the tracks having the drag marks, myself, I believe that's just a tired deer. A younger deer can do that as well as an older deer. So that to me is no indication of the size of the deer. You will notice, and many people will say, well, the buck's always dragging his feet, and that is true. Although the reason is because he's usually tired. The doe doesn't travel near as far as the buck. She's not near as tired. The buck is. So as far as the size determining between big deer and small deer drag marks, I don't pay any attention to. But the stagger, as we both agree, I believe, Jim, is the wide chest, and that is a definite indicator of an older, bigger, mature buck. And I think that's the biggest thing that I look for when I go. And I think that's, if not only the size of the print, obviously a bigger, older deer has a bigger print, and that stagger gives away that he's a big, old, mature buck. And that's the key ingredient for me. You know, in between, when you say, Jim?
Yeah, well, actually about dragging their feet, all deer drag their feet one time or another, depending on the depth of the snow.
Yep.
If you come across a track that is decent size and there's that much snow and the deer's dragging his feet, you can almost bet that he's a buck that's tired, just like Joe said. He's dragging his feet because he's tired, he don't want to lift his legs up. And you'll find that those bucks, especially when they get older, they get lazy. They'll do as little as they possibly have to do, except during the breeding season. And as Joe said, you know, it just makes sense. A good buck is usually 20% bigger than the biggest does there are around. So you figure that he's got to have longer legs, he's got to have a longer stride, he's got to be bigger through the chest. So it just makes sense that those are the tracks that you follow. Now, there are also difference in lengths of deer. This past fall, one of my great nephews killed a 10-pointer that we figured was a real heavy deer. We thought that the deer weighed probably, I don't know, I think we talked about 180 or 190 pounds. When he actually weighed it, it was 156, that's all it weighed. And the difference was the deer was thick through the chest, but he was so short, he just didn't have the body length and he didn't have the weight. So, you know, there's things that you look for. Every deer is just a little bit different, but they act pretty much the same depending on the time of the year. And Joe's mentioned this before. Later the season goes and the bucks get tired, they tend to be more lazy, drag their feet more, and they're in a survival mode. They're trying to survive, so they reserve and keep as much energy as they possibly can.
Now, as far as like the track impressions, a young deer would tend to stay on their toes, right, a bit more, and then you'd have a flatter track with two flat tracks.
It's been documented many times, and I believe it's to be true. The heavier deer then will sink the back of the print much more. The younger deer, he's on his toes, he's not near as heavy. You know,
so the dew clothes will show more on a heavier deer and older deer. They tend to stand more flat-footed.
And yeah, even the back of his print, like you said, will be in more, and like Jim said, the dew claws will be in more. So yeah, that makes sense.
On large tracts of land, such as the Adirondacks, how do you begin to break down which areas to hunt? When you are looking at a map and topography, what are the specifics you look for?
Well, as far as areas to hunt, I like to go for the higher ground. And by that, I don't mean the peaks. I just don't like to get down in the bogs and run into a lot of water that you can't get across. It's a lot easier to travel, and you can travel a lot farther. That's what I look for.
Actually, if I was just taking a map and I was looking at a place to try to figure out where to hunt, I used to always try to look for a ridge that rolls out of a swamp. You've got swamp areas where they're cover for the deer. You get up in the ridges, they've got a little more feed up there, it's more open, they can see a little bit better. And really, if I was just looking at a map, that was what I'd come by. The other thing is if you could find a place that's been logged, especially logged within the last 2 or 3 or 4 years, the deer got a lot more feed, they're going to hang in those areas, and they'll have a better chance of making it through the winter.
Scouting is one of the most important parts of hunting. but just as important is determining what the signs you found actually tell you about the area and the deer activity. One of the most common mistakes is the misinterpretation of the meaning of rubs. There are many different reasons that bucks make rubs, but two of the most common and important to understand are breeding rubs and signpost rubs. Can you provide the viewers with a brief explanation about the different types of rubs that you can find in the woods and how to break them down and what those can actually tell you about where you're hunting?
Well, as a tracker, when it comes to the big buck rubs, I look more for the size of the rub than I do why he rubbed it. I'm looking for a big bodied older deer. Usually the bigger bucks rub the bigger trees. Now that's not to say a big buck won't rub a small tree, he certainly will, but it's pretty rare for a small buck to rub a big tree, especially if it hasn't been rubbed before. So to me, the rubs are just more an indicator of the size than anything.
Yeah, and I would go along with that. There's one exception there that you could probably run across to it. Depends on the size of the antlers of a deer. If your points come real close, the tips come real close together, the deer can't rub a big tree. So you'll have to rub either sideways or rub smaller trees, which they do. And the other thing about rubs, which is really important, is that it depends an awful lot on the rub, the size of the rub, and how high up the tree it is or how low it is. Naturally, the higher up it is, the deer could be a little taller deer. If an indication, if you got a rub that's up as close as your shoulder, say when you're standing up, the deer's got to have a high set of antlers that stick way up in the air. So it's a good indication that you're on a real trophy buck because the rub is so high. Contrary-wise, if you get a rub that's down closer to the ground, but it's still a big tree, the deer could have a fairly wide spread, but a low set of antlers. So it's a good indication of what you're actually looking for just by looking at the rub and studying it that way.
But to answer your question as far as whether it's a breeding rub or whatever, I don't pay that much attention to it. It's more on the size.
Yeah, and they'll start rubbing from the time that the velvet starts coming off until their antlers fall.
Yeah.
So rubs go the whole length of their.
Actually, the antler's life once
right,
the velvet
right.
comes off.
That's right.
Yeah.
Do you practice any forms of scent control or not, and why?
Any form of scent control, we don't. I don't think Jim does much as far as scent
The
control.
whole thing is to stay clean,
Yeah.
Stay clean, don't have a lot of body odor, I would think. Joe had mentioned that he's a dairy farmer and he seems to do a little bit better when he's out with the cows the day he hunts. So.
Yeah. I think it's important not to be in with deodorant and perfume and all like that. Be as natural as you can, and that's what we do, and hope for the wind direction to be right.
The one thing to think about too, and it was mentioned, Larry Benoit said this first, as far as the wind goes, when you're tracking a buck, the wind in the woods blows from all different directions. It could be north, south, east, what you don't know. And if you're tracking a buck, quite often they will travel downwind now. They didn't for a lot of years, they always traveled into the wind. Now because of coyotes and predators, they have a tendency to travel downwind more so they can smell if something's coming up behind them.
One of the most crucial aspects of tracking is known as the JHook, which describes the path a buck takes right before he beds down. Can you explain the JHook to the viewers and how you prevent a buck from busting you in the final moments of tracking?
Well, the JHook is like any other thing that nothing's 100% in the whitetail world. And he does seem to a lot of times hook right or left. He rarely goes straight and lays down, although they do. My biggest thing to challenge him busting out and me getting a look at him is how fast I approach. The slower the better when you're getting close to a buck. That's it in a nutshell for me.
And Joe's proved it so many times.
Yeah.
Like shooting them bucks at 10 and 15 yards in their bed that far away from them.
Yeah, and one other great tip for anybody who's trying to track and whatnot is to not look just straight ahead. You got to look all the way around in front of you because of the JHook. He will swing by over there, and you'll spot him over there to your right or to your left, even though he walks straight at you.
Yeah. That's where the JHook comes from. The deer will go down to a certain line and then he'll make a line to the right or to the left and he'll make a hook that looks like a J. So that's why they call it that. And quite often he'll bed down in a spot that's elevated a little bit so he can see a little bit further down the head and watch his backtrack usually. That's what they're looking for, watch their backtrack.
But slower the better.
What kind of guns do you prefer to use and why?
Well, myself at least, and Jim also, we like the lighter the gun, the better. If you're going to travel on these bucks and you're going to cover a lot of ground, you don't need the extra weight. And I think, and we had mentioned this earlier, the most important thing is to be very, very familiar with your gun. Have it so you know where it shoots, you know how to shoot it, you've shot it a lot. That's the most important thing. I think the rest is all just hand in hand.
Yeah.
You know?
A number of years ago, Joe and a bunch of friends of theirs bought me a Browning 308 with the Browning rifle itself has a 60-degree throw on the bolt, which is 20 or 30 degrees less than what most of the rest of them are. So if you're thinking about using an action and having to shoot fast, if you have a rifle that you don't have to work the action quite as far, well, it just makes sense that you can do it quicker.
Yeah.
Joe has proved that so many times. You think a lot of times he's shooting an automatic. Oh, that's Joe shooting.
And we happen to stay away from the automatics because they seem to jam, because we do put them through so much.
I feel like the less amount of mechanisms you have, the less that can fail sometimes.
Exactly right.
Thank you guys for doing this.
All right.
Okay, you're
You
welcome.
bet.
All right.
Well, goes well.